So the first step of building our prototype is to import our app designs. Through this course, we're going to be building a cool new app called Pinterest. I don't know about you, but I love pies. So having an app where I can look at photos of pies all day just sounds like heaven. Before we import our Pinterest designs though, I'd like to run through some of the nuances when importing Figma into ProtoPie. The first thing I want to talk about is components. When you create a component in Figma and import it into ProtoPie, it comes in as an editable group, but there are some restrictions to how that group can be imported. So there are some downsides. So one of the downsides is that if you add a fill to the container, to the Figma container, that's not going to be brought through the importer into ProtoPie. Another thing that isn't supported from components is rounded corners. So there are enough things around components which are negatives, unfortunately, at the moment, which means that I normally just break my components apart in Figma before I bring them into ProtoPie. Okay, the second thing is if you hide a layer in Figma, that's going to suppress it from being imported into ProtoPie. So that's actually quite a good way if you want to have layers which you don't want to import, you can just hide them inside of Figma. Text layers are imported into ProtoPie as text-ready layers. And what that means is that they're not going to instantly come in as editable text. You're going to have the ability to convert them into editable text inside of ProtoPie, but to preserve the typeface, they come in as text ready. So they're effectively still graphics, but that does mean that they will support the typefaces and the fonts that you choose. When you convert a text ready layer in ProtoPie to real text, you're going to have to, and we'll go through this, you're going to have to load the font onto, say, your device when you're testing on your device to make sure that renders correctly. Okay, so if you reduce the opacity of a frame in Figma for a component or group, it's ignored on import. So the only opacity which is recognized is when it's applied to actual object layers, Figma object layers. And then finally, if you apply any text effects such as stroke, it will be imported because as I said previously, the text layers are like in this text ready format. But if you do convert them into editable text in Figma, you're going to lose those effects. So just some things to bear in mind when you're prepping your Figma files before you bring them into ProtoPie. Okay, so if you're following along, please download the attached Figma file to the course. That's section 2, Pinterest assets. And I've already prepared this file so it conforms to all of those importing guidelines that I've given you. So you don't need to worry about any of those for this particular file. Make sure you've got the file open in Figma. With that open, as you can see here, we're going to go over to ProtoPie and we're going to create a new pie. So that's just going to create a default untitled file, and it's going to default to the iPhone 11 Pro. So we're going to be building this app for the iPhone 11 Pro. So we're just going to use the default preset. So that's all absolutely fine. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to this import menu here. So we can see we've got the three options. So the three supported apps, Adobe XD, Figma, and Sketch. So we're going to choose Figma. And we're immediately going to get this permissions dialog from ProtoPie. So because Figma's an online tool, we need to give ProtoPie permission to access our Figma files. So we're just going to tap the Proceed to Browser button. That's just going to bring up a browser window, and we're going to be asked to give access. So let's allow access. So that's done. We can go back to ProtoPie and we can continue. So let's go back to import and choose Figma again. Okay, so we've now got the Figma import dialog open. So let's just step through the options that we've got here. So the first thing we can see is this drop-down box, which shows us all of the frames that we've got inside of our Figma file, which is just sitting in the background. And to the right here, we've got the options to choose the import size. So you can see it's defaulted to at 3x, which is the same as the pixel density of our iPhone 11 preset. But we do have the option to change that to another density. You want to make sure that this density matches your preset density for your ProtoPie file. Otherwise, your graphics are going to come in at the incorrect size. The next thing that we have some options on is how we import layers. So by default, it's going to import all layer structure. So what that means is it's going to take the Figma layer structure and it's going to duplicate that correctly inside of ProtoPie, which for the most part is how you want to import your designs into ProtoPie. There is a secondary option, which is only layers marked for export. So if you do want to have a bit more granular control over what you import from Figma, you can export specific layers. And if you choose this option, then it's only going to import the exported layers into your ProtoPie file. The rest of the options are all regarding another feature inside of ProtoPie called re-import. You can re-import a Figma file after you've initially imported it. And this has kind of got limited benefits, certainly from my perspective. I don't really use this that much, but just to kind of step through the options so you understand what they mean. So by default, these first two options are ticked, which are overwrite positions of layers and overwrite sizes of layers. So if you have already imported your file and you go back and you change the position of the layer or you change the size of the layer, so effectively you're changing the design, it's when you re-import it, it's going to update all of the layers where you've made those changes. The other two checkboxes, which are update layer orders and grouping structure. So again, if you've changed the grouping structure or you've moved some layers around in Figma, it's going to apply those changes to your import when you re-import it into ProtoPie. And then finally, we've got remove layers deleted or made invisible in Figma. So as you saw before, when I said if you make a layer invisible, it's going to block it from being imported. So this is going to happen if you check this option if you re-import. But just to reiterate, this is only relating to if you use the re-import feature, and that's not really something that we use a whole lot. Okay, so we're going to initially bring in our first screen, which is our start screen. So we're just going to hit the import button and it's going to connect to Figma and it's going to import all of those layers. And as you can see, it's brought it in. If we look at the layers panel here on the left-hand side, you can see that it's accurately rendered all of our layers and our layer names as they appeared inside of Figma. And one of the things to point out here is that when you use the importer from Figma into ProtoPie, it's going to import everything as PNG files. So they're going to be pixel-based graphics. It's going to make groups out of the frames that you've got. So that's all rendered like for like between the two. And here's one of those text ready layers I was talking about. So you can see it's got a little T in the corner, but it's also got an image icon. So that means that it's a text layer and I can convert it into text, but at the moment it's still just an image. Okay, so that's our first our first screen imported. That's good. So now we want to import the other two screens. So we've got a login screen and we've got a home screen to import. You can see here that our first screen has got a little label scene 1. So ProtoPie has the concept of scenes, and we're going to be creating some more scenes to import our other screens. So we're going to be breaking our prototype down using the scenes feature within ProtoPie. So if we go over to this little icon just under the import button that we used, and we just tap it, we can see scene 1 and we can see this plus button. So we can use that to add a new scene. So we're going to add a couple of scenes, and we're going to double click on scene 2. So make sure we've got scene 2 active. And we're going to go back to import Figma, and we're going to import our second screen, which is the login screen. Again, we're going to leave everything at its defaults and hit import. Downloading the layers there, and there we go. Bang, we've got our whole screen rendered inside of ProtoPie. Okay, so let's go to our third and final scene. So double click on that, scene 3. And we're going to go back to import Figma, and we're going to bring in our home screen. Okay, that's looking good. I'm just going to rename these scenes. So we can rename these scenes by just double clicking on them. So I'm going to call this start. This one's going to be login. And finally, the third one we'll call home. Okay, so let's go back to our start scene for a second. So just double click on that. And I want to talk a little bit about SVG. You can import SVG into ProtoPie. Unfortunately, the importers, and that goes to all the importers, whether it's Figma, Sketch, or Adobe XD, they don't support SVG import at the moment. At the moment, they're just, as we saw, they're bringing in PNGs. But there are some features within ProtoPie where you're going to want to have SVGs inside of your file. So I'm just going to show you how to import an SVG, and it's relatively painless. So what we're going to do as an example of this is we're going to replace the Pinterest logo here. So if we skip back to Figma and we find our start screen, and we're just going to select the Pinterest logo, and we're going to right click or control click if you haven't got a 2-button mouse, and we're just going to choose copy paste, which is at the bottom of the menu, and we're going to choose copy as SVG. Okay, so let's skip back to ProtoPie, and we're just going to do a regular paste here. So Command V, Control V if you're using Windows, and you can see we've got our logo, but you can see it's much smaller. And this is because we've got this pixel density thing going on. So our current iPhone 11 is at 3x, but SVGs, because they're resolution independent, they don't really have a pixel density. So ProtoPie just brings them in at 1x. So effectively, in our current screen, it's a third of the size. But that's easily fixed. So if we keep our SVG selected, and we're going to come over here to the size values, and inside of these inputs, we can effectively do some simple maths. So we're just going to multiply this width by 3, and just make sure this should be on by default. Just make sure you've got the little padlock locked. So this will lock our aspect ratio. So we can just put ×3 in this field, and it's going to scale our logo up correctly. Okay, so now we've got our logo scaled correctly. We're just going to position it more or less in the correct place where our current pixel-based logo is, and we're going to go into our layers palette. I'm going to delete the pixel-based logo. So we've got this SVG. So this has got yet another icon. So you can see it's got a little image icon with this little circle in the bottom right-hand corner. And we're just going to double-click on this, on the name, and we're just going to call it logo. Okay, so that about wraps it up for the Figma import video. So as you can see, it's relatively painless to bring your assets into ProtoPie from Figma. There are a few optimizations, a few things that you'll need to do to prep your file just so you get the best out of the importer. And I've also showed you how you can bring SVGs into ProtoPie from Figma as well. So if Figma is your tool of choice, then you can skip the next couple of videos. Do make sure you watch the import from file system video though. So there's some things in there you'll need to know before we progress. And I'll see you in the next tutorial.